mostly the coastline is more populated than the other two regions. The bigger cities are placed, of course, on the coastline. Not only today, a long time ago, it was already so. You remember I told you that these small cities on the coastline were mostly founded by the Greeks and the Romans, and they became, in the course of the 13th century, all small city-states. All the walls were built in the course of the 12th and the 13th century, and they were pulled down then in the 19th century during the French and Austrian rule, because there was no need anymore for that type of defense. And the coastline is really influenced by the great Mediterranean cultures, and then at the end by Austria, for example. But Dalmatian hinterland is a little bit different because the Ottomans ruled here for a longer time, so the people were dressing differently, the traditions is different, the food is different than on the coastline, and the people are very conservative, very religious, and very, very conservative. For example, still today, in many villages in the hinterland, only sons they inherit everything. The daughters, they don't inherit anything except grandmother's laundry and some jewelry or some, and that's it. But a long time ago, you know, the land on the coastline was not really expensive because no one lived on the coastline except in bigger cities, as I told you. So the people practically lived in small villages on the slopes of the hills or behind the mountain chain, and they had their fields here, so they lived close to the fields. Only the fishermen, they had their small stone houses on the coastline, but they also didn't live there. They lived in a proper village, but then they had a stone house where they were spending their summers, and in the winter time they were putting their boats inside, and they had their gadgets and tools, whatever they needed. So the coastline developed with the development of tourism, and until this happened, the daughters were always inheriting the land on the coastline, which was totally cheap and no one wanted to have it. And this is the reason why I always say there is God. What goes around comes around, because the families of the daughters made a profit out of the whole story then at the end, because now they own the whole coastline. And of course today it is different. The coastline developed the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century. The rich Austrians, the so-called Habsburgs, I don't know if you remember the Habsburg family, the big Habsburg monarchy ruled in Austria. They were building their winter holiday homes in Dalmatia, since Dalmatia belonged to Austria for more than 100 years, and they were spending winters here and summers back at home because it was too hot for them. They were also building and founding first so-called hygienic societies. These were like tourist boards for health tourism because of the pine tree forests. The people who had some respiratory problems with their lungs, for example, they were always moving to the Mediterranean area, and they were spending some time here in the so-called clinics, like hospitals, in order to feel better then, of course, of the time. And but the real tourism developed after the World War II, beginning with 60s. What happened in the 60s? You probably haven't ever heard of Winnetou. Winnetou is an Indian, and it's a fictive story, of course. The writer who wrote books about Wild West and the Winnetou Indian and Old Shatterhand, his best American friend, he was a German, and he was imprisoned for a lifetime. And he never ever visited the United States, but he wrote many books about Wild West. Incredible how this man actually knew something about Wild West. Of course, whoever comes from that part of the United States will probably, if he will read the books, he'll probably find some mistakes. It's normal. But the whole Europe was reading these books. I remember when I was a child, the first books my grandpa gave me were the books about Winnetou. And then
LA? Hindi, dito sa hotel room. kanyang battery? Ah? Full. Wow.
The bottom of the deep northern bay was inhabited and the city of Salona was placed there. The whole peninsula of Split was not inhabited. Only the southern port, today's southern port, was inhabited by the Romans. After Diocletian built this beautiful palace. And then in course of the time, the city was born. After the World War II, only the old town existed. I remember my father was born in 1946 and he told me that the whole peninsula was really, we only had pine tree forests. And so this means that in the course of the last 60, 70 years, everything happened. So maybe now we can proceed. You will have the possibility later to make more pictures. Croatian history is very interesting especially because Dalmatia, the historic region of Dalmatia, that is today considered to be the area between the city of Zadar and Dubrovnik. Zadar is placed on the side of the
Mawasak na. Mabibig-tibag na yan. Yan ang industry yan na. Semento. old road.
Mm-mm.
Nice. Bato-bato. Pero maganda na yung road system nila.
I like taking a break from here.
Lipat tayo dito, mama.
Prutas yata mga tinatanim.
Lipat tayo.
If you in here really, it's the reason why you will see also here in the hinterland so many new homes that don't really look like one family house. The people usually build more than one apartment, and they live in one apartment and they rent all these other apartments to tourists. And this is the way how the people can earn some extra money, because we don't really earn much in Croatia, especially in Dalmatia. So 700 euro per month is a good salary for highly educated people, believe me. And since we are used to have less than today, we somehow always manage to arrange. And almost everyone has more than one job. For example, I teach and I translate, and then I'm a guide too, and many people, you know, whoever searches for a job in tourism during the time of high season, he'll find something. It is really so. So we are really hard-working people, at least 8 months, 9 months a year. And then in the winter time, December, January, February, it is very peaceful and quiet here. The only tourists that visit Croatia in December, January, February are the tourists from Asia, especially Japanese tourists. They really travel 12 months a year. They don't mind if the weather is not fine. Anyway, they don't really like the sunshine, so they prefer sometimes, you know, to travel in the winter time. South Korea, for example, to Thailand, less China. Somehow we have less tourists from China than Japan, and also from United States. Sometimes, you know, December and January they do with cruise ships tours, but with smaller sail wooden cruise ships. They do cruises on the Adriatic coastline. I was always wondering, you know, how come in the winter time, because the weather is not always really fine, but it is so. So 3 months quiet. Last year, at the beginning of September, we had the U.S. military ship U.S. Truman in the port of Split. And you're Canadian, you don't know. Okay, so the season lasted until the middle of December. Really, it prolonged the season because all these soldiers, they booked tours all around Dalmatia, and of course there were so many Game of Thrones tours too. So I was doing only Game of Thrones tours almost every day, because there are not so many guides in Split that do the Game of Thrones tours, not so many fans of Game of Thrones as in Dubrovnik. So when